Dust rose in the dry air, swirling around the auction stage like a curse. The sun beat down on Bitter Creek, a hard little town with harder people. Men leaned against railings and posts, spitting tobacco and watching the day's human lots like cattle. Laughter rang out, mean and sharp, as the auctioneer cleared his throat and stepped up to the platform. Next up, Lot 32, he called, wiping sweat from his brow with a stained kerchief. One woman, around 25, maybe 27, expectant, strong, knows how to cook, clean, sew. Comes with one boy, about yay high. Not her blood, but raised him like her own. All eyes turned to the woman who stepped forward, her spine straight despite the weight of her belly. Clara Monroe. Her clothes were worn but clean, her hands clasped tightly around the wrist of the little boy beside her. Tommy looked terrified, eyes darting between the crowd and the woman who was the only family he had left. Clara didn't flinch when the jeers started. Who'd want a woman about to drop? Someone muttered. Bet she's got fire in her, another smirked. Give her a few weeks to rest, she'll be worth double. Boy's skinny, probably eats like a rat. Tommy buried his face into Clara's skirt. She didn't cry, she hadn't since her husband was shot over a stretch of land he couldn't afford to lose. She hadn't cried when the sheriff turned her out of the house. And she wouldn't cry now, not in front of them. Startin' at $5, the auctioneer shouted. $5 for the pair, you ain't gonna find a better deal. A few hands hovered, one man raised his. $6, someone else called, squinting like he was sizing up livestock. $7, another voice barked. $8. Clara closed her eyes. Then the crowd parted. A tall man stepped forward, wearing a dusty coat and boots that looked like they'd seen 100 miles. He was broad, with a heavy belt hammer hanging from one side and the look of someone who'd spent more time fighting than talking. Caleb Rowe. He didn't speak until he was at the front. The auctioneer looked startled. I'll take him, Caleb said. Full price. No bargaining. The crowd hushed. How much you offerin', mister? The auctioneer asked carefully. Caleb dropped a leather pouch onto the platform. It hit with a dull thud, heavy with gold dust. Enough to shut every mouth in that square. I said full price. That'll cover it. The auctioneer stared at him, then at the pouch, then at Clara. He gave a reluctant nod and banged his gavel. Sold to Mr. Caleb Rowe. Clara opened her eyes, confused. She didn't know who he was. No one did, not really. Just a blacksmith who lived on the edge of town, kept to himself, didn't drink, didn't talk much. And yet, there he was, offering safety she hadn't dared hope for. Caleb looked at her and Tommy. Come on, he said softly. Let's go. And just like that, they walked off the platform, free, but not yet sure of what came next. The town watched them go, whispering, wondering what kind of man buys a pregnant widow and her orphan, then says nothing more. The morning light spilled across the plains, stretching long shadows over the modest homestead tucked a mile outside Bitter Creek. The cabin was simple. 2 rooms, a stone hearth, a small barn, but it was solid. Safe. Clara stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl, her hand resting instinctively on her belly as she watched the horizon for nothing in particular. The prairie wind tugged at her loose hair. It smelled like rain was coming. Inside, the clang of hammer on steel rang out from the forge behind the house. Caleb was already at work, stripped to his shirt sleeves, arms slick with sweat and soot. Beside him, little Tommy struggled to lift a pair of iron tongs. He was small, but determined, and Caleb never told him to stop trying, only showed him how to do it better. They'd been living there for 3 weeks, and in all that time, Caleb hadn't once tried to touch her. He hadn't asked her to cook, or clean, or sleep in his bed. He'd moved his things to the small workroom off the back and given Clara the larger room for herself and the boy. Then he started building a second room. No explanation, no discussion. Just hammer, nail, and purpose. Clara didn't know what to make of him. He was kind in a quiet way, never spoke more than necessary, and treated Tommy like a son. But she knew men. They always wanted something. So every night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind press against the walls, she waited for the moment he'd come to collect whatever he thought he'd bought. That moment never came. Instead, there were odd moments of gentleness. One evening, she'd mentioned she liked honey with her tea. The next morning, a small jar sat on the kitchen shelf. Another time, Tommy had spoken of a book he missed, an old, tattered volume of frontier stories. Caleb had tracked one down in town and left it on his bed without a word. It made no sense. Kindness wasn't free in this world, especially not from a man who could afford to pay gold for strangers. Clara finally asked him, one night as they sat on the porch watching the stars creep in. You bought us, she said quietly, her voice barely above the chirping crickets. Why? Caleb didn't look at her. He rubbed a cloth over his hands, slow and deliberate. Because you needed safety, he said. And I had it to give. She frowned. But you don't even know us. You didn't know my husband. Or Tommy. You didn't know if I'd run off or rob you in your sleep. I didn't need to know that. Then what did you need to know? He finally looked over at her then. really looked, his eyes the color of stormwood. That you deserved better than being sold like livestock. That the boy deserved a chance to be more than a name on someone's ledger. That's all. Clara stared at him, her throat tight. There was no hunger in his eyes, no smugness, no expectation. Just truth. She had no reply. She just looked back out into the dark and let the silence stretch between them, softer now, something almost like peace. Inside, Tommy slept with the book pressed against his chest. The house creaked gently as the wind rolled over the roof. And for the first time in months, Clara felt something she hadn't dared to name. The autumn sun warmed the dust of Bitter Creek, and the streets buzzed with the annual harvest fair. Stalls lined Main Street, selling everything from fried dough to hand-stitched quilts. Children ran between horses and wagons, ribbons in their hair and cider on their lips. For once, the town wasn't just surviving, it was celebrating. Clara walked slowly, her newborn daughter nestled in a sling across her chest, her skirt swishing with every step. Tommy darted ahead, face smeared with apple juice, clutching a carved wooden horse Caleb had made for him the night before. His laughter cut through the din like music. He looked like a child again, not a burden, not a mouth to feed, just a boy with a toy and a full belly. Caleb walked beside Clara, quiet as always, but his presence was solid, anchoring. He had shaved for the first time in weeks and wore his cleanest shirt, though the sleeves were still rolled to his elbows. Townspeople watched them pass, some tipped their hats, others whispered behind gloved hands. There goes the blacksmith and his, what is she, anyway? Heard he bought her, paid a full pouch of gold. She's got a baby now, can't be his. Look how fast that happened. Clara heard it all. She kept her chin high, but her hands tightened around the sling. A group of women passed by, church wives in lace collars and judgmental stares. One of them, Mrs. Langley, wrinkled her nose and muttered, he could have had any woman. He chose her. Caleb didn't react, but Clara's ears burned. At the edge of the town square, a drunk rancher stumbled out of the saloon, half a bottle swinging from one hand. He staggered toward them, reeking of whiskey and bad decisions. His eyes slid over Clara with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. Well now, he slurred, grinning, ain't you a sight? Didn't think they sold whores with babies still in 'em. Clara flinched as he reached out, fingers swiping for her waist. Before she could move, Caleb was there. The sound of the punch was wet and final. The rancher hit the ground hard, his hat flying off, blood pouring from his nose. People stopped to watch. No one stepped in. The man groaned, clutching his face, and spat a red string into the dirt. You think you saved a broken woman? He sneered through swollen lips. You bought trash, blacksmith. Might be shiny now, but she'll rust like the rest. Caleb stood over him, fists still clenched, chest rising with quiet fury. His voice was low, but it carried. I didn't buy her, he said. I freed her. I gave that boy a father. And I gave this town a choice, to keep acting like it's still ruled by dirt and dollars, or become something worth raising a child in. No one answered. Not the rancher, not the preacher standing by the pie stall, not the men who had once raised bids on Clara like she was livestock. Caleb turned to Clara and held out his hand. She took it, and together they walked away, her baby stirring softly against her chest, Tommy running ahead once more, unaware of the weight that had just shifted behind him. That night, as the fair wound down and lanterns flickered in windows, people in Bitter Creek spoke in lower voices. About the blacksmith who punched a man cold. About the woman he defended like a wife, even if he never called her that. About how maybe, just maybe, the rules were changing. By the time spring came to Bitter Creek, the land had softened. The snow was long gone, replaced by wildflowers pushing up through the thawed soil and trees bursting into bloom like they'd been holding their breath all winter. The town, once hardened by drought, violence, and survival, had begun to stir with something else, possibility. At the edge of town, Caleb's forge burned hot, the sound of hammer meeting steel ringing out steady as a heartbeat. The smithy had grown. 2 extra workbenches, a new roof, even a small covered area where Tommy, now 9, worked alongside him. He wasn't just pretending anymore. Caleb taught him like a true apprentice, showing him how to shape a horseshoe, temper a blade, and keep his temper cooler than the forge fire. Tommy thrived in the work. He was stronger now, more confident. He asked questions, cracked jokes, and sometimes hummed tunes while he worked. The boy who once hid behind his mother's skirts was becoming something new, someone who knew his hands had value. Inside the house, Clara moved through the kitchen with a quiet grace. Her baby girl, Ruth, was just learning to walk, toddling between chairs and the patched-up floor with uncertain steps and a determined little scowl that reminded Clara of her late husband, and Caleb too, in a way. The child had his focus, his silent strength. Clara had started teaching again. Not just Ruth or Tommy, but the neighbors' children too. At first, it was 1 or 2. Then more came. She taught them letters, numbers, and the feel of a story beneath their tongues. She made the old storage room behind the smithy into a classroom, filled with worn chairs and chalkboards Caleb had built himself. The town hadn't had a Teacher since the war. They hadn't asked her to be one, but they hadn't stopped her either. And now, on market days, folks came to her door asking for advice. Medicine, mending, prayers, sometimes just a voice that listened without judgment. They stopped calling her the widow and started calling her Miss Clara. Or, quietly, Mrs. Rowe. The preacher who once looked down his nose at her came by with a pie one afternoon, stammering an apology for the things he'd said, things he hadn't even realized she'd heard. Clara accepted the pie. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. One day, the sheriff came by with a grin and a cigar, leaning against the fence. "Caleb," he said, "I know you hate politics. But the town's thinking about holding a vote. We need a new deputy. Someone steady. Someone people respect. That you." Caleb just looked at him, brow raised. "You don't have to say yes," the sheriff added. "But folks would feel better knowing you're the one they're coming to if things go wrong." Later that evening, after the sheriff rode off, Clara found Caleb fixing the hinge on Ruth's cradle. She stood watching him in the golden light pouring through the window. "You going to take it?" she asked. He shrugged. "I didn't plan to." "You didn't plan to take in a widow either." He looked at her. "Didn't plan to." "No." She sat beside him, close but not quite touching. After a moment, she spoke, softly. "Why did you, Caleb? Back then, why'd you really buy me?" He set down the screwdriver and wiped his hands. His voice was calm, but not guarded. "Because I saw something in you that deserved a life better than what they were offering. And because I knew I could protect it." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her fully then, a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "Now I don't think of it as something I did. I think of it as something I was lucky enough to be part of." Outside, Tommy called for help with a stubborn nail. Ruth shrieked with laughter as a butterfly landed on her hand. The scent of wood smoke and wildflowers mingled in the air. Clara reached over and placed her hand on Caleb's. "You gave us more than safety," she said. "You gave us a chance to become something else." Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. And across the west, in places where the wind still carried rumors and names like ashes on the breeze, people spoke of the blacksmith who bought a pregnant widow and her orphan. How he asked nothing in return. How he built a new life, not just for them, but with them. And how, in doing so, he didn't just change one family.